If you know the sound of that good old diesel engine, you've already heard the official story. Fuel economy. Harder to set on fire. Both true. But there's a third reason most tank videos never mention, and once you hear it, it changes how you understand not just the M60, but the Abrams and what's coming next. That third reason wasn't about saving money or preventing fires. It was about surviving the first 72 hours of World War III. Let's back up. The M60 descended from a lineage that ran from the M26 Pershing in 1945 through the M46, M47 and M48 Pattons. Each one America's iterative answer to Soviet armour that kept getting better and kept getting more numerous. By the mid-1950s, the M48 was in service and already showing its age, powered by a gasoline-burning Continental AV-1790 that drank fuel at a rate its crews found alarming and caught fire with a frequency they found terrifying. The switch from gasoline to diesel was coming regardless. But the specific diesel that went into the M60 and what the Army demanded that diesel be able to do, that's where the story everybody else misses actually begins. In the late 1950s, as the Army Ordnance Corps and what would become US Army Tank Automotive Command at Warren, Michigan, started writing requirements for the next generation of combat vehicles, a formal multi-fuel engine program took shape, and its logic was disarmingly simple, grim but simple. If the Soviets launched a conventional attack into Western Europe, NATO's fuel supply chain would be one of the first things to die. Forward depots hit by tactical aviation, pipeline infrastructure from North Sea ports severed. The neat plans assuming a steady river of the correct fuel, reaching the correct vehicles at the correct time. Gone within days, maybe hours. So the Army's answer was this: build engines that could burn almost anything. Not just standard military diesel, DF2, but JP4 aviation fuel, JP8, commercial kerosene, civilian heating oil. In emergency conditions, even blended gasoline mixtures. The concept was that a tank crew cut off from its supply line in the chaos of a Soviet breakthrough could pull up to a West German farmhouse, drain the heating oil tank in the basement, pour it into the fuel cells, and keep fighting. They could siphon JP4 from a damaged airfield's fuel bladders. In the most desperate case, they could burn captured Soviet fuel stocks, manufactured to completely different specifications than anything in the NATO system. This wasn't some informal guideline scribbled on a napkin. Continental Motors, working under Army Ordnance direction, developed an entire family of multi-fuel engines during this period. A systematic engineering program driven by a doctrinal requirement that came down from the highest levels of Army logistics planning. The LDS 427, later redesignated LDT 465, powered a generation of Army trucks and was engineered from scratch with the combustion chamber geometry, fuel injection systems and metallurgy to tolerate wildly different fuel types without eating itself alive. And the engineering challenge here was enormous. Think about what multi-fuel actually means at the mechanical level. You're asking one engine to reliably ignite and burn fuels with wildly different properties. Different cetane ratings, different viscosities, different flash points, different sulfur content, different lubricity. JP4 is thin and volatile, almost like gasoline. Civilian heating oil is thick, sluggish, nowhere near as refined as military-spec diesel. Captured Soviet fuel might have sulfur levels and additive packages that would corrode Western fuel system components in hours if the metallurgy wasn't right. These engines used a spherical combustion chamber design that promoted turbulent mixing of fuel and air at temperatures high enough to achieve reliable ignition across that entire spectrum of fuel properties. The injector systems had to atomize everything from watery JP4 to syrupy heating oil into droplets fine enough for consistent combustion. The fuel injection pumps needed density compensators capable of metering accurate fuel volumes despite radical changes in viscosity. Because if you meter diesel fuel by volume and then switch to JP4, which is significantly less dense, you get a lean mixture that can destroy an engine in minutes. The seals and gaskets throughout the entire fuel path had to survive prolonged contact with chemicals that varied enormously in their corrosive properties. Exhaust valve metallurgy had to tolerate the higher combustion temperatures and corrosive byproducts, especially sulfur compounds, that came with burning low-grade fuels never intended for high-performance engines. Getting all of that to work in a truck engine was hard enough. Getting it to work in a tank engine, producing 750 horsepower, while keeping the thing reliable enough for a 19-year-old crew to maintain in the field, that was a different order of problem entirely. That same institutional thinking, that same logistics anxiety, shaped every requirement written for the engine going into America's next main battle tank. The Continental AV-1790-2A, a V12 air-cooled supercharged diesel displacing 1,790 cubic inches, 29.3 litres, producing 750 horsepower at 2,400 RPM and weighing 4,700 pounds. The designation tells you everything if you know how to read it. A V for air-cooled V configuration, D for diesel, S for supercharged, 1,790 for displacement. Mated to an Allison C D850 series cross-drive transmission, it gave the 52-ton M60 a top road speed of 30 miles per hour and a range of 300 miles on 385 gallons. Those are the spec sheet numbers. What the spec sheets don't usually mention is that this engine was designed from day one to tolerate fuel that wasn't standard diesel. Crews could, and during training exercises sometimes did, run the AV-1790 on JP4, on kerosene, on heating oil. There was a performance penalty. Power dropped. Exhaust got dirtier. The engine ran hotter on some alternative fuels, and crews had to watch temperatures more carefully. But the injector pumps and fuel system seals were specifically selected to handle varying lubricity and viscosity across different fuel types. Technical manuals included procedures for fuel switching that treated it as an operational capability, not an "oh God, we're desperate" last resort. Could you pour heating oil into a main battle tank and keep it fighting? Yes. And in the scenario the Army spent 2 decades planning for, that wasn't a footnote. That was a survival requirement. If you crewed one, you probably knew this. And you've probably noticed that most YouTube tank videos don't. Now, to understand why the Army cared about multi-fuel capability this intensely, you have to stand in the Fulda Gap in your mind, which is exactly where tens of thousands of American tankers stood in reality. The Fulda Gap. Actually, a pair of corridors running through the hills of Hesse, roughly 50 miles northeast of Frankfurt. The terrain feature that kept NATO logistics planners awake for 4 decades straight. Soviet war planning called for a massive armoured thrust through these corridors, aimed at Frankfurt and the Rhine crossings beyond, with the objective of splitting NATO's forces and reaching the Channel ports before the alliance could fully mobilise. The forces arrayed to stop it were outnumbered. Everyone knew it. And through the 1960s and into the 1970s, what made the numbers so terrifying wasn't just quantity. It was what the Soviets were fielding. The T-62 brought a 115mm smoothbore gun that outranged and outpunched anything the M60 carried at the time of its introduction. Then came the T-64B and T-72, with 125mm smoothbores, composite armour and autoloaders that let a three-man crew match the rate of fire of a Western four-man crew. NATO intelligence assessments of Soviet armoured capability in Central Europe made for grim reading. Thousands of tanks, backed by mechanised infantry, massed artillery and tactical air, all oriented toward those corridors in Hesse. The M60 wasn't outclassed in every category, but its crews understood the math. You were going to be outnumbered, possibly 3 or 4 to 1 in the critical sectors, which meant you had to shoot, relocate, shoot again, and keep moving, trading position for survival, using terrain and speed to offset the numbers disadvantage. And that doctrine, shoot and scoot, fight from successive battle positions, fall back before you get fixed and overwhelmed, depended entirely on an engine that would start every time, run reliably under enormous stress, and keep running even when the fuel feeding it wasn't what the manual preferred. A dead engine in a fighting position wasn't just a maintenance problem, it was a casket. NATO's broader plan was to trade space for time, fighting delaying actions that would slow the Soviet advance long enough for reinforcements to cross the Atlantic and for political leaders to make the terrible decision about nuclear weapons. In that scenario, the logistics picture was nightmarish. Planners estimated frontline armoured units might be cut off from organised resupply within 48 to 72 hours of the first shots. After that, you were fighting on whatever sat in your vehicle and whatever you could scrounge from the landscape. And here's the thing. West Germany was an industrialised nation with a dense civilian infrastructure. Millions of gallons of heating oil sitting in basement tanks across Hesse and Bavaria. Commercial diesel in agricultural equipment and trucking depots, kerosene in storage, aviation fuel at military and civilian airfields. Think about the density of that fuel, scattered across farms, factories, gas stations, airports, apartment buildings, just sitting there in every direction. A multi-fuel engine turned all of that into a potential fuel source. A single fuel engine turned all of it into nothing. This wasn't theoretical anxiety. This was the organizing principle behind American armored force design in Europe for an entire generation. The M60 crews who trained in the Fulda Gap corridor year after year, who knew the terrain so well they could name individual tree lines and call engagement ranges from memory. They were trained to fight a war in which the supply chain was expected to fail. That Continental diesel sitting behind them in the hull was one of the Army's answers to that expected failure. The scenario got tested in abbreviated form every year from 1969 through 1993 in the Reforger exercises. Return of forces to Germany. Simultaneously, the largest peacetime military logistics operations in history and the most brutally honest stress tests NATO ever ran on its own supply chain. The purpose was to prove the United States could fly troops to Europe, marry them up with pre-positioned equipment stored in massive depots across West Germany, and deploy them into combat positions before the Soviets reached the Rhine. The mechanics of it was staggering. Soldiers flew into German airfields, sometimes commercial airports pressed into dual use, and convoyed to POMCUS sites. Pre-positioned overseas materiel configured to unit sets. Massive warehouses, climate-controlled, where rows of M60s sat nose to tail in preservation, sealed up and theoretically maintained on a regular schedule by garrison crews. Theoretically. Because every tanker who ever drew a POMCUS vehicle knows the reality was messier than the theory. You'd get to your assigned tank and start the deprocessing sequence. Remove the preservation coatings, check fluid levels, hydraulic, engine oil, coolant, transmission fluid. Batteries were often dead, flat dead. Not weak, not low, dead. Sitting for months in a warehouse, even a climate-controlled one, kills batteries. You'd need slave cables from a running vehicle or a generator cart. Track tension had drifted, rubber pads worn unevenly, road wheels showing dry rot on the tires. Fuel system seals that had been sitting static for months might weep when the engine finally pressurized them. The air-cooled fins on the AVDS-1790 collected dust and debris even in a warehouse, reducing cooling efficiency until someone spent hours cleaning them. Turret hydraulics had to be bled and tested, radios checked, frequencies set, antennas mounted. The gun tube had to be bore-sighted, fire control systems verified, and that's all before you drove the thing a single meter. First days of any Reforger were consumed by these maintenance marathons. Crews working 18, 20 hours straight to bring cold machines back to life. Some vehicles wouldn't start at all. Some started, but threw warning lights immediately. Some ran fine for 10 kilometers and then threw a track or blew a hydraulic line. The failure rates during draw and deployment were one of the most closely tracked metrics in every Reforger after-action report, and they were consistently higher than the planning assumptions predicted. Every exercise demonstrated the gap between the maintained on-paper readiness of pre-positioned equipment and the actual readiness when human hands touched it for the first time in months. And then came the fuel. Moving thousands of armoured vehicles across hundreds of kilometres of West German roads and fields burned fuel at rates that strained even peacetime logistics networks operating with no enemy interference at all. Fuel convoys got stuck in traffic. Distribution points ran dry faster than planned. Vehicles outran their supply tails. Imagine what a Soviet Air Force would have done to those fuel convoys. Every Reforger, that question hung in the air. Nobody had to say it out loud. Reforger 1984 sits in a particular spot in the memory of a lot of M60 veterans. That tells you something important about where tankers sat on the Army's equipment priority list. They got their tanks upgraded eventually, but the small stuff, crew weapons, personal equipment, toolkits, lagged a generation or more behind. If you carried a grease gun in the 80s, you're probably nodding right now. And while we're talking about what it actually felt like inside these machines, because the people watching this don't need to be told what an M60 is, they need to hear their own experience reflected accurately. The M60's torsion bar suspension gave the tank a ride that everyone who ever sat in one describes in remarkably similar terms. A slow, undulating bounce. A wallowing, rocking motion at moderate speeds over uneven ground, like 52 tons of steel pitching and rolling in a gentle ocean swell. At Aberdeen Proving Ground, civilians who got their first ride were often struck by this. Not the violent jarring they expected, but this strange, almost organic undulation as the long hull flexed across terrain. For crews, that motion was the rhythm of their working lives, the baseline against which everything else, loading the main gun, reading a map, trying to eat, had to be accomplished. You didn't fight the bounce, you learned to work inside it. Consider a tanker who entered service on M60 A1s in the early 1970s and stayed in armour long enough to crew M1A2s, SEPs in the early 2000s. 30 years, 5 major variants. That career spans one of the most dramatic technological transformations in the history of ground warfare, experienced from inside a turret. His early M60 A1 had no thermal sights. None. At night, his tank was effectively blind. The standard technique was to coordinate with battalion mortar platoons firing illumination rounds. Mortars would loft parachute flares over the engagement area, and for the 60 to 90 seconds those rounds burned on the way down, crews had light to find targets. Then darkness. Then waiting for the next round. Fighting in staccato bursts of visibility. The sudden white glare swinging under its parachute, the frantic seconds scanning through your sight. The boom of the main gun, then blackness again. That was the plan for stopping a Soviet force equipped with infrared searchlights and active night vision devices. You trained for it. You practiced it. And if you're honest about it, you knew it was barely adequate. When the M60 A3 TTS arrived, built around the AN/VSG-2 thermal imaging system, fielding around 1979 and 1980, it was revelatory. Suddenly, you could see in complete darkness, pick out thermal signatures against terrain, fight at night with something approaching daytime effectiveness. Every tanker who lived through that transition remembers the first time they looked through that TTS eyepiece and saw the world in thermal contrast instead of impenetrable black. That single system changed the entire tactical calculus of what an M60 crew could do after sunset. But through all those leaps, M1, M1A1, M1A2, M1A2 SEP, the fundamental question of what powered the tank and how you sustained that power in a fight remained the thread connecting every generation. Which brings us to the break. Mid-1970s, the ex-M1 program that would produce the Abrams came down to 2 prototypes. Chrysler's entry, powered by the Honeywell AGT-1 gas turbine, producing 1,500 shaft horsepower, and General Motors' entry, running a diesel. In November 1976, the Army chose Chrysler's turbine. This was not accidental, and it was not a mistake. The AGT-1500 offered a power-to-weight ratio the diesel couldn't touch. It gave the Abrams acceleration and sustained speed that redefined what a 60-ton tank could do. Started reliably in extreme cold, a real advantage for a German winter fight. Lower noise at idle, smooth, progressive power delivery that crews found intuitive and responsive. For the tactical requirements of the late 1970s, a tank fast enough to survive on a battlefield saturated with anti-tank guided missiles, one that could sprint from defilade to defilade faster than an enemy gunner could track, the turbine was a rational answer. The people who made that decision weren't fools. They were solving a different problem than the one the M60's designers had solved, and they solved it well. But the turbine came with a cost that cut straight to the heart of what the multi-fuel diesel had been designed to address. The AGT-1500 consumed fuel at roughly twice the rate of a comparable diesel. The M60 could manage something around 2 miles per gallon on a good day. The Abrams, in combat conditions, burned fuel at rates approaching half a gallon per mile, or worse, depending on terrain and tempo. Its 500-gallon capacity gave a theoretical road range of 265 miles, but sustained cross-country operations slashed that dramatically. A single armoured division of Abrams tanks needed a fuel logistics tail that dwarfed what the same division would have required with diesel. The exhaust was intensely hot, a thermal signature visible from considerable distances, and a practical hazard for infantry working near the rear of the hull. And that massive logistics tail, the fuel trucks, the distribution points, the supply convoys snaking across the countryside, represented exactly the kind of vulnerability the multi-fuel doctrine had been designed to mitigate in the first place. Now, here's where it gets genuinely interesting. The AGT-1500 was technically also a multi-fuel engine. It could burn JP8, diesel, gasoline, kerosene, and more. On paper, multi-fuel capability survived the transition. But in practice, what changed was volume. A multi-fuel engine that sips fuel gives you flexible logistics. A multi-fuel engine that gulps fuel gives you a bigger logistics problem, regardless of what it's drinking. The original doctrine wasn't just about burning different fuels. It was about reducing dependency on a fragile supply chain. The Abrams turbine, despite its technical multi-fuel capability, made the tank more dependent on a massive and continuous flow of fuel, whatever type that fuel happened to be. The elegant logic of the M60 approach, efficient enough that scavenged fuel could meaningfully extend combat operations, didn't survive the transition, even though the Abrams was, by every other measure, a vastly superior fighting machine. So what made the turbine's thirst politically and doctrinally acceptable? A parallel shift in NATO thinking that fundamentally rewrote the logistics playbook. Beginning in the 1980s and formalized through NATO Standardization Agreement, STANAG 4362, the alliance adopted a single fuel forward policy built around JP8, one fuel type for everything: trucks, tanks, helicopters, aircraft, generators. The logic was elegant. Standardizing on a single fuel simplified the supply chain so dramatically that multi-fuel complexity disappeared. One kind of fuel truck, one kind of bladder, one set of contamination standards, one set of handling procedures. Single fuel forward effectively undercut the original rationale for multi-fuel capability. If NATO could guarantee a standardized supply of JP8 to every unit on the battlefield, why did you need an engine that could burn heating oil? The multi-fuel doctrine was born from the assumption that supply chains would collapse. Single fuel forward was built on the assumption that they wouldn't. And for a while, for Desert Storm, for Iraq, for Afghanistan, for every conflict the United States fought from 1991 through 2021, that assumption held. The Abrams turbine's fuel hunger was a real logistical burden, but the supply chain never truly broke because the United States never fought an enemy capable of seriously threatening it. No adversary had the long-range precision fires, the air power, the cyber capability, or the special operations forces needed to systematically interdict American fuel convoys hundreds of miles behind the front lines. The logistics worked because nobody was shooting at the fuel trucks. Whether that assumption holds against a near-peer adversary in 2025 is a question the Army is asking right now. And the answer they're arriving at looks a lot like the answer the M60-era planners gave 60 years ago. General Dynamics unveiled the Abrams X technology demonstrator, and the detail that should stop everyone paying attention is the powertrain. After 4 decades of turbine power, the Abrams X runs a diesel-electric hybrid. Not just a return to diesel married with electric drive motors that give the vehicle something no Abrams has ever had: silent watch capability. The ability to sit in a fighting position with the main engine off, running on battery power, thermally cool and acoustically invisible, waiting. No turbine whine. No massive heat plume broadcasting your position to every thermal sensor in the battle space. Just silence and patience, and a full charge waiting to bring the diesel online the instant you need to move or shoot. The Advanced Combat Engine program, reportedly built around a Cummins power plant, isn't just chasing fuel efficiency for its own sake. It represents a fundamental rethinking of the relationship between a tank and its supply chain. Exactly the kind of rethinking the Cold War multi-fuel planners were doing in the 1950s. When you're planning for a fight against a near-peer adversary who can threaten your supply lines with precision fires, cyber attacks, and long-range interdiction, the old fear comes back. The exact same fear that put a multi-fuel diesel in the back of the M60 in 1960. What happens when the fuel trucks stop coming? That tanker who served on 5 variants from M60A1 through M1A2 SEP, he lived the whole arc, diesel to turbine to whatever comes next. He fought with mortar illumination in the dark before thermal sights existed. He felt the M60's slow, undulating bounce in his spine for years before he ever heard a turbine spool up. He heard the Continental diesel clatter to life on cold mornings in Germany and kept that sound somewhere in his memory even after the turbine's whine replaced it. His experience isn't nostalgia. It's primary source evidence for a 60-year argument about how you keep tanks fighting when everything goes wrong. And the Reforger 1984 driver with the grease gun on his hip. He was carrying World War II steel into a Cold War exercise designed to test whether NATO could survive a fight that might end civilization. He knew the supply chain was the weak link. His engine knew it too. Turns out, the old thinking wasn't old at all. So, if you crewed an M60, if you heard that diesel engine every day and knew what it could do, drop your variant in the comments. Tell us which model, which unit, which year. Because this story isn't finished, and the people who lived it are the ones who understand it best. Subscribe for more stories like this.